Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to a No Small Talk Sunday. um, the you know, every generation thinks that the world that they're living is unique and weird and crazier than normal. Um, there always seems to have been um, the haves and the have-nots, and there always seems to have been those who um, have an inherent caring for others and those who do not. Uh, there has always been a class of people who tried to justify their selfishness, essentially try to make it look good, put lipstick on, I've got mine, screw you. There are those who cannot pass by someone in need. Most people, except for a few, if they saw an animal in distress on the side of the road, they would stop and help. It's a deeply ingrained aspect of how our brain and nervous system is hardwired to be caring. Aside from the rare instances where there is something wrong with your brain and your nervous system and the wiring, a genetic anomaly or some kind of birth trauma injury that has literally broken the machinery. Most infants and babies are empathic. It has to be a learned thing to be non-empathic and to not care. Yes, there are sociopaths. There are psychotic people. That will always be so, and that is the aberration and the weird factor on the bell curve that we all know will be there forever. But in, our present society, we see that there are those who have great wealth and use it for selfish means, and people with great wealth who give huge amounts of it away to help people and establish programs for some altruistic purpose. There are regular people who don't have much. For instance, it's a classic example of homeless people to give you if you're in need, which I think is very interesting concept of living that close to, life and death on the street, and every dollar you can get helps, and to give away to fellow people in need in that situation. It's, as we will see, hardwired in the brain, this idea of empathy and caring. It's a necessary aspect of the nervous system that has evolved over time that allows us to live in civilized groups that are larger than just the family unit. So in prehistoric times, our ancient ancestors, had family and extended family, mother and father and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and grandparents, and then that family unit would bind together with another family unit because there was greater chance of survival when they banded together and worked together in a symbiotic relationship. And perhaps a third family and a fourth family and a fifth family would show up, and pretty soon you've got a tribe. In order to live with essentially strangers that are not DNA related to you in a family, there has to be some hardwired mechanism that develops in order to care for other people in your unit, because your unit is a survival organism of its own. Essentially, we've formed ourselves into a larger version of a multicellular organism, which is what I am, right? So all these multicellular organisms band together and make a larger organism. Way back in the, 4.2 billion years ago, when Earth was still just cooling from being a molten mass being struck by planetoids and asteroids and everything else, with volcanic activity and most of the Earth covered with molten lava. At some point that began to cool, water showed up. I did a whole live stream on where all this whole story, but it's now pretty much confirmed that the water on our planet came from ice asteroids crashing into the planet in its early formation, which formed our oceans, which eventually formed our atmosphere, formed the original pools of the primordial ooze, where our really, really ancient ancestors came from, little single-cell organisms that are, duking it out for the food morsels in the primordial ooze of the early planetoid of planet Earth. But I've said this before as well. Something happened somewhere in that mix of the early planetoid, where there is single-cell organism duking it out for the food morsels. Something shifted, and nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows what caused this shift. A shift where organisms began to realize that if they banded together, that their survival chances were greatly improved. And more organisms began to band together into the early prototypes of multicellular organisms like you and me, entering into true 100% symbiotic relationships with each other, where each depended on the other's survival. Now we find ourselves in a similar situation, except the multicellular organisms, you and me and all of us on planet Earth, all 8 billion of us, we are, for the most part, in our history of our species, are duking it out in competition for the morsels of money. Money is now the higher order placeholder for food. You don't grab your spear and go chase food. You hire somebody to go and do that for you, and you pay them money to do it. In the beginning, it was barter. I make good sandals, you're a good hunter, I'll make you sandals if you get me some meat. But after you've got your sandals, there's no more business for us to do, and I still need meat, so now I have to barter with somebody else who's a good hunter. When I've run out of good hunters, and I've got all of the stuff that I could trade with them, now I have to do a second order of barter. Right? The hunter that I want to get meat from has already got sandals, right? But he doesn't have a hat. And I don't make hats, but my friend makes hats, and he needs sandals. So I trade sandals to him for a hat, and I trade a hat to the hunter for meat. Now it's starting to get a little complex, because at the third tier, I've got to trade with 2 people and kind of move it around, then have to trade with 4 people and move it around. And pretty soon it gets like really complicated. So a placeholder is now coming into existence. The first foundational idea of money, a placeholder that everybody accepts. If I give this to you, you can give it to somebody else and you can get your goods. That placeholder is now money. So it's rooted in your deepest unconscious survival instincts as the coin of survival. This is how I survive. My survival depends on this. My roof over my head, the gas in my car, the food on my table, the clothes on my back depend on this placeholder. The worth of the placeholder is directly related to the sweat of my brow. Unless I'm born into wealth, and now we have higher order conditioning of people who trade in money futures, buy and sell money and on an international exchange where money in different countries is equal to different worths, and that fluctuates, and I can buy and sell money. It's called higher order conditioning. Pretty soon, I want money for its own sake and not for what it will buy. That's an illness. That's a sickness. That's an addiction. That's as bad as cigarettes and alcohol. It's like being an alcoholic, except with money. And as we all know, as soon as money is involved, altruism and empathy and all the finer things that make humans wonderful and lovable and evolved disappears. Hoarding, I've got mine, screw you, why should I take care of you, I had to work for mine. Those kind of attitudes are unevolved. And as we will see, there's direct evidence that the evolution of neural structures always leads to more empathy, always leads to more of me being sensitive to seeing the world through your eyes and being more and more cognitively aware of my effect on other people and the world at large. That everything I do has its effect, has its ripple pattern that goes out and affects other people's lives, for good or for bad. Once I begin to become consciously aware of my own existence, and I expand that self-awareness, and I find myself and the world as one. It was a great, the student comes to the master and says, how shall I treat other people? What's the most enlightened way of treating other people? And the master says, there are no other people. And from a Tibetan Buddhist standpoint, that's true. God divided into an infinite number of finite parts, and each part became a shard of their of Godhood's personality and sedimented into form. And that form was a resonance, and the resonance spun harmonics and overtones, which became organs and glands and systems and emotions and physical bodies. And then all those shards were caused to forget and entered into the greatest heroic journey of all time to find out the true nature of my soul. And as you widen that, you realize that we are all brothers and sisters in spirit, and we all are genetically related to each other, and we all are a giant family of one entity. one entity with many facets. There are no true strangers in the world, except the ones that I make so. So, today we talk about empathy. One of the more important things to experience in your life. And a hallmark of awakening, a hallmark of evolving your consciousness. And there are multiple levels of zones in our brains which are deeply involved in the process of empathy. And various types of analysis have been done of these various zones that are severely deficient in psychopaths and malignant narcissists and things like that. Basically, the three primary zones of the brain are the reptilian brain, the most primordial brain of all. It's like the brainstem area, particularly the pons, medulla, that kind of zone. It includes partially the cerebellum. This whole zone down here is the ancient brain, the instinctive brain, the survival brain that acts on instinct and acts before you have a chance to think about it. Deeply tied into the sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous systems in the hypothalamus, which is right here. Then there's the limbic brain. That's the emotional brain, the hippocampus and the amygdala. And this emotional brain has roadways that attach itself into the autonomic nervous system itself, into the reptilian brain, and into the higher brain centers. And then we have the neocortex, the cortex proper, the noodles that we normally think of as the whole brain. And then this section up in the front here, the frontal cortex, is the most evolved of the neocortex. So the entire neocortex is one thing, but it's also segmented and compartmentalized in all kinds of different sort of duties. And the frontal cortex up here is higher brain centers. The hippocampus and the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the limbic brain, and the reptilian brain. Now, when I talked before about the information that George Ivanovich Gurdjieff brought back from the mystery schools from the Middle East and as far as Georgia and Russia, and he talked about humans being a three-brained being, where you have a physical part and an emotional body, a physical body, an emotional body, and a mental body. That's pretty much what this is all about. He further divided it into the fact that the physical body had also a mind and an emotion, a mental body, an emotional body, and a physical body within the physical body. And the emotional body had, a physical and an emotional and a mental body. And the mental body had a physical, emotional, and mental body. That's 9 types, which became the 9 personality types laid out on the sacred Enneagram. A circle with 9 divisions with lines attaching them in a funny way. Gurdjieff is the one who brought the concept over of the law of 3 and the law of 7. The law of 3, electromagnetism, positive, negative, and neutral, and the law of 7, music, 7 notes in an octave. And as we've talked and discussed in these broadcasts, those are the true main forces in the universe that make everything. Sound and light in a giant yin-yang, where sound is the only thing in the universe that is not on the electromagnetic scale. It's pure energy moving through a medium at a certain frequency. But the process of caring for another person, of finding your heart reaching out to someone else in distress or pain, the impetus from someplace inside of you to reach out to see if somehow you can help ease another's pain or help them. At the core of that is the great altruistic impulse of the healer. Anyone who is involved in the healing practices of any kind, that is a deeply ingrained part. Yes, of course, there's going to be people who, become a medical doctor for the money. It's like being a high-level technician working on a car. But most of the people that I know in the healing field have a strong empathic structure, which means that they're already a more evolved type of person from perhaps last lifetimes or something, already worked that part out, and are born into this world with a high degree of empathy. This is not a new thing. This is millions of years of evolution, that have started in prehistoric times, where our super prehistoric ancestors cared for one another. There were the healers, there were the spiritual coaches, there was the shamans. There was a great deal of empathy for another person if they were wounded. There have been articles in my news feeds recently in the last few months that have shown that they found a tribe of Neanderthal skeletons in a cave, and one of them had a healed, broken leg, which means that people had to have cared for this person until they could stand up again. And that's 6 months. When you don't have doctors and hospitals to set the bone, that person couldn't hunt for themselves, they couldn't cook for themselves, they couldn't take care of themselves, they couldn't walk. The tribe came together and supported this person. It's deeply ingrained. Ancient bones show that caring for the disabled is as old as society itself. Research has indicated that the bones pictured belong to a man who was buried as he lived, since his fused vertebrae and brittle bones left him hunched over by his diseases. He was cared for as a member of the community. And it's not just humans. I mean, it was humans before we had human form. As far back in our ancestral tree as you can go. The impetus is hardwired in our nervous systems to care for one another and to see things from another person's standpoint. It's a process of dumbing down to not have that. In a world where more and more people do not care and do not surrender to the knee-jerk response to care for another person. The knee-jerk response is, I can't just walk by this person. I have to stop and help. That requires a reversal, a dumbing down of a natural, evolved state of consciousness. And it's interspecies as well. I've seen on my news feeds, I've also shown pictures of a monkey helping a cat out of the water when it was drowning. Another dog trying to help another dog in a raging stream jumped into the water and helped it survive. It's not just humans. It's spread throughout any kind of organic system that has any kind of level of consciousness and lives in tribes and lives in communities with each other. That is a set thing that has to be there. You can't live in a community if you can't have empathy. And caring for one another can't happen. You have to pull together in a symbiotic whole. And yes, there are more factors involved in this than that there is an actual energy exchange that takes place. There is an empathic bonding that happens in our energy fields. So we already know that this concept of coupled oscillators, which is the physics law behind sympathetic resonance, why the wine glass vibrates when you sing the right note. How come my body clocks time themselves to the world? How come I have, if I'm a woman, I have a menstrual cycle, I have a ovulation cycle timed to the full moon and the new moon of 28.5 days. That's bio clocks. That's me synchronizing up with inanimate objects, never mind other people, right? If we're within 6 feet of each other, the heart field of my muscles in my heart and the huge electrical impulse that goes through there from the AV node, autonomic nervous system, vagus nerve to the AV node, huge electrical sweep goes across the heart and makes the heart muscle contract. And there's a huge pulse of electromagnetic field that sticks out 6 feet from my body. So if you're within 6 feet of me, we're mingling our electromagnetic fields of our hearts. And if we stay there long enough, it will start to synchronize. We'll synchronize our brain waves, our respiration, our heart rate, our pulses. That's the coupled oscillator effect. It's accentuated if we hold hands. Now we have an electromagnetic connection directly through skin conduction, galvanic skin response. It accelerates it. It makes it more powerful. You don't have to touch another person to have an empathic bonding with them through your electromagnetic fields. Now, when you become, when your sense of empathy, if you're born with a sense of empathy and a nervous system that is extremely highly tuned, then you enter into a new sort of format of becoming an empath. And an empath is now a sort of empathy on steroids. I mean, I pick up what you're feeling, and I feel it myself. I feel physically your pain in my body. I feel your emotional pain in my emotions. And things like that. And I saw many of those people as patients in my 40 years of practice. People who just were absolutely in the wrong century. When your nervous system is the type of nervous system that extremely finely tuned, it just can't take the constant bombardment of electromagnetic fields, AC current coming from the wiring in your walls. That extends out 6 feet. And your body clocks are trying to dance with that partner to save energy, and that partner is not dancing back. You just got fooled into using twice the energy to dance with a partner that you thought was going to save you half. It burns your system out. And, you're hypersensitive to, power lines and 5G and radio waves and military frequencies and smart meters and 5G and, you know, and it blows your system away. And when your system is blown away and your fight or flight response runs for a while and then it sort of collapses, now you're more vulnerable than ever. And these people are in pretty bad shape. So once again, you have to rebalance the autonomic nervous system, get it back to a 0 point, and allow the internal physician to right the system and get it back in the saddle, get its stress handling ability back. And then you have to muscle that stress handling ability up to be abnormally strong for these people so they can handle just the ordinary stuff in the 21st century that the rest of us somehow seem to be able to work through with a deficit, with a handicap. So I guess the downside of empathy too strong is an empath. And real empaths have a very, very difficult time living in cities. They do better in the country where they don't have houses on either side of them. Things like that. But this magnificent structure and all the different parts and places within this structure, all the way down into the DNA, which grew this structure in the first place, means that the seeds of empathy are in the blueprints inside the DNA that grew this structure with its multiple modes and nodes that all work together in order to orchestrate the experience of empathy that we experience. And research has been digging into this now for decades and has accelerated in the last few years. More and more information, and particularly in the last year, on high-level research-funded studies into what is empathy and the importance of empathy in the brain. Now, this is a simplified version of the brain. You know, the real deal is way more complicated than this. These are the major big old divisions, but each division has divisions. There's a lot more. There's 20, 50 times more detail in the brain than these broad sort of areas, you know. But this, you know, here's the outside of the brain, and here's the inside between the two hemispheres. And this zone right here, this green zone, number 6, is, you know, the emotional control zone, the hippocampus and the amygdala. Here it is here. This is the the sensory and the motor cortex. These are also involved in empathy, as we will see. This one's involved. These are involved. Sensory association area, or memory of sensations that we've had in the past that may have been positive or negative that are now like a sort of a Pavlov dog response. Emotional expression from the underside of the brain, where in the frontal lobe. The latest research has shown that the primary sections for empathy is this area right here called the anterior cingulate cortex. It's adjacent to and heavily wired into the hippocampus, which is in this sort of same zone here. And this area here called the insula. So when you when you look at the brain, and you know, so you can see under here, now we know that there are certain areas in the cortex underneath here that are involved in emotional processing. And that when we look at it from the side, this is called this Sylvian fissure. And there's an extra lobe here that actually comes apart right here. And it's inside this area here where we find the insula in here. So let's look at this picture again. So now we can see the insula is down inside that fissure in this zone, which has to do with, you know, being empathic to another person's suffering. The mysteries of how empathy is represented in the human brain have begun to unfold. Imaging studies show that certain brain regions, the insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, this one, become active not only when we experience physical pain, but also when we witness empathically another person suffering from the same sensation. The somatosensory cortex up here, where the sensory cortex and the motor cortex come together, somatosensory cortex, in contrast, gets activated only when a person directly feels physical pain. So when I feel it in my own body, I feel it here. When I see somebody else suffering from the same kind of pain I've experienced, I experience in this zone, and this zone, and as we'll see in a bunch of other zones. And we will see that they're actually incorrect in this statement, because the sensory cortex does get involved in empathic experiences of another person. This is some of the later work that's happened, the compassion network and the empathy for pain network. I mean, it's pretty fascinating stuff. I mean, empathy for pain network are these zones, and compassion network are these zones. The fact that they've mapped it out to this level is pretty fascinating. Here's one of the major researchers in the Netherlands, Professor Christian Keizers. It is an exciting time to be a neuroscientist. We now have many powerful tools to peek into the brain and see how its activity relates to our behavior and our mind. Neuroscience can give us the tools to help those with mental disorders and to unravel the mysteries of what makes us who we are. His main thing is empathy, his main research, which is part of a new broad category in neuroscience in general, the science of studying empathy. What makes the brain tick, and why do we care for each other? And what happens in the brain when we abnormally don't care for other people? Now, mirror neurons is one of the big things that has stood out from this, because aside from areas in the cortex where we see increased neuron activity in the act of empathy, aside from areas in the cortex that light up, there are brain waves, rhythmic depolarizations of neurons that fire together in sweeps across the cortex at certain speeds equals consciousness, beta, alpha, theta, delta. And this concept of mirror neurons, neuroscience behind empathy and social connection, this mirror neuron idea, I've dealt with for 40 years in my practice. But mirror neurons are in a special category. Of course, you know, most of the EEG community still is stuck with the first original 4 brainwave states that I learned 50 years ago in school: beta, alpha, theta, delta, where the lowest delta is 0.5 hertz one brain pulse every 2 seconds, all the way up to 30 hertz, 30 firings per second, which is higher concentration beta, externally directed focused attention. I discovered epsilon, which is brainwave frequencies below delta, in 1989 by studying all my patients with EEG for 2 years and studying the brainwave entrainment concept. And below delta brain activity, I named it epsilon, associated with metaphysical experiences, out-of-the-body experiences, precognitive experiences, spiritual insight experiences. I extended that exploration into epsilon 2. So if the lowest delta is 0.5 hertz, that's one brain pulse every 2 seconds, then epsilon 1 would be one brain pulse every 2 seconds to every 4 seconds, one octave lower than that. And I also explored brain frequencies slower than that. I call that epsilon 2, one brain pulse every 4 seconds to every 8 seconds. And then they discovered gamma at 40 hertz, and all of a sudden, the lid was off of this. The horse was out of the barn. I mean, they told us that here's the house, there's no basement, there's no attic. I discovered a basement and a sub-basement. Somebody else discovered an attic in gamma at 40 hertz. And hypergamma at 100 hertz and lambda at 200 hertz. Further research has shown new brain frequencies discovered at 500 and 2500 hertz. I haven't even gone there yet, haven't had time, but that's on the shelf to explore. Then they discovered the default mode network, which was the frequency just below epsilon 2 that I was exploring. So epsilon 2 was one brain pulse every 4 to 8, and default mode network is every 10 to 20. My latest explorations are below delta. Below default mode network, that I call iota 1, iota 2. And then there's the borderline states. There's all kinds of 21 different brain states that we've identified so far. There's more on the way, because we now know that gamma modulates theta and lifts all the information out of the brain into wireless network. There's another brain state, 22. But we also know that other research is showing us that beta is combining with delta, 23. And ultimately, it means that all 21 brain states are most likely modulating every other brain state. For instance, gamma, it doesn't just modulate theta, it modulates alpha, it modulates beta, it modulates delta, it modulates epsilon. And all of those are new brain states. So the number of brain states, 21 times itself, that's how many brain states it could be. And the strange and odd brain states tucked into the corners are the mirror neuron brain states. That's called MU, M-U. So MU brain activity is a section in sort of the middle of what normally is the alpha band, but it's not alpha. It's a new brain frequency that is deeply associated with empathy and how we learn socialization skills as a baby. So and the reason they're called mirror neurons is because in the sensory cortex, where I receive information from all my 5 senses come in, and those all go into the sensory cortex. And that means the things that I'm seeing, right? So I'm a baby and I see my mother. And my mother is, cooing and oohing and awing and when she talks to me. But when she talks to other people, she talks as an adult to them. And I'm hearing those qualities of voice inflection as she speaks whatever language it is. And I'm learning that. The areas in my brain that would be required for me to activate my voice and my lips and my teeth and my tongue in order to make the same noises that she's making are lighting up in my brain and creating pathways. They're not shifting over to the motor cortex and making my mouth move. They're just lighting up like mirror neurons and burning pathways. That's how I learn tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, socialization skills. I learned to read the textbook of what real language is all about, not just the sounds coming out of my mouth, but facial expressions and body expressions and tone of voice. And there's a whole constellation of what real communication is all about, aside from just sound waves coming out of my mouth. And we all learn that as infants through the mirror neuron mu wave activity. My introduction to mu was as a physician and whose main category of working with patients was children with neurological developmental disorders and with women with menstrual problems, pregnancy problems, things like that. Those two groups were the big groups that I dealt with for years. So I dealt with ADD and ADHD and dyslexia and autism and epilepsy and all the rest. And in particular, with autism, the mirror neuron function is deficient to some degree. And the deficiency of mirror neurons and mu brain activity is worse and worse and worse the further up the spectrum you go in autism. So in the high level of the spectrum, there is no socialization skills at all. The mirror neuron function did not work, and they learned nothing about tone of voice or facial expression or body language or any of the other stuff that you need to understand what other people are doing and what the whole thing means and what the rules of the game are. So there's no eye contact because I don't recognize you as something. I'm not seeing you as something special. I'm not privy to your tone of voice or your body expressions or anything like that. It doesn't mean anything to me. At the lower ends, it's deficient, and that was part of the overall treatment plan for restoring the autonomic nervous system to a state of balance, so the internal physician programs could start working on all these functional deficiencies. And one of the brainwave entrainment frequencies that you would use for that is mu. We would retrain mu function in your brain with binaural beats and brainwave entrainment. We would restore that function by taking your brain to a gym and making it fire mu waves and burning those pathways. Another thing that we saw with autism was gamma deficiency, gamma brain waves. Gamma is the binding frequency where it binds all the five senses information together in one place so they all synchronize up and make sense in my world. And if gamma is deficient, then the things I see and the things I hear don't seem to belong together. I don't know that they're supposed to belong together. My world becomes fractured. And then I feel like I'm being bombarded from separate visual and separate sound and separate touch and separate information. It doesn't belong together. It's all just bombarding me. And pretty soon I'm like doing behaviors like this or banging my head or trying to stop the noise. Retraining gamma function stops all that. Retraining mu stops all that. But it wasn't until recently where some of the conversations that I was having in the forums, both in this group and in my practitioners network, Sky Collective, that somebody asked the question, could we use mu entrainment to boost the function of empathy in the brain? And I had never considered that before because my whole work with Mu was in deficient brains with autism who had no socialization skills or deficient socialization skills. Never occurred to me somebody with normal socialization skills, if you used Mu brainwave entrainment, could it expand that ability, right? And now that's a project that's popping off the shelf, and I'm going to make a soundtrack, a Mu soundtrack for empathy. That will come back down the pike in a few months. Empathy. Being inside another person's experience and experiencing it as your own. And then reaching out to comfort and to help heal. Empathy is patiently and sincerely seeing the world through the other person's eyes. It is not learned in school, it is cultivated over a lifetime. There are 3 types of empathy. Compassionate empathy, where the need to react and provide help in any way you can. You have to step forward and do something. I understand what you feel and I want to help. Affective empathy, the ability to experience the feelings of other people. I feel with you. Cognitive empathy, the ability to rationally understand a person's feelings and thoughts. I put myself in your shoes. But this one here is the evolved one. The call to action. It's not good enough just to feel it. I have to reach out and do something. Mirror neurons and the neuroscience of empathy. Groundbreaking research in the 1990s discovered that mirror neurons fire whether monkeys perform an activity themselves or observe others engaging in it. In the decades since, studies suggest that humans also have mirror neurons, and they are fundamental to what it means to be human. Neuroscience shows that mirror neurons impact our ability to grasp new skills, acquire knowledge, and form deep emotional connections with those around us, even helping us understand why people do what they do. And now it's entirely possible to boost that ability with Mu brain entrainment, and not just gamma entrainment. Mirror neurons. Mirror neurons in our brain are responsible for our ability to understand quickly and instinctively what others feel and experience. They encode not only the movement, but also the intention of another person. Mirror neurons help us to differentiate facial expressions, which is important to develop empathy. People on the autism spectrum likely have a less active mirror neuron network. And it's not just likely, it's proven in multiple peer-reviewed journals and PubMed articles over the years. Now we're getting someplace. Look at all these brain structures involved in empathy. Using scanning technology, scientists can identify parts of the brain that are active when we empathize with others. By combining those results with other findings, the psychological evaluations to genetic testing, researchers are beginning to determine which biological and environmental factors reinforce or corrode our capacity for empathy. So, viscerally reacting to others' physical pain. Here. Mirroring people's actions and emotions. That's Mu function. Reading the eye expressions and movement. Imagining thoughts of others. Recognizing emotions, pains, and awareness. The amygdala. Extremely altruistic people have more neural activity in their enlarged amygdalas, a part of the brain associated with learned emotional responses and the processing of distressing stimuli. And this is listing each area of the brain and which part of empathy it sort of processes. The anterior insular cortex, that was the one that was down inside the Sylvian fissure. The insular cortex, the origin of empathy, according to one study. So each one of these different areas of the brain has a very specific part to play in empathy as a whole that is really a multi-phased animal. And as I said before, an empath, a person with preternatural ability to apprehend the emotional state of another individual, one who feels the emotions of others despite the fact that they themselves are not going through the same situation. Empaths be like, I don't just listen to your words, I listen to your use of words, your tone, your body movements, your eyes, your subtle facial expressions. I interpret your silences. I can hear everything you don't say in words. Are we wired for empathy? What do mirror neurons teach us about our empathy? Throughout our brains, says neuroscientist Marco Iacoboni, we have a type of brain cell that mirrors what we perceive from others. This recent discovery may be the biological basis of empathy and a key to understanding the social brain. Which begs the question of, it's going to be an interesting experience to entrain mu function. Here is the mu function. Between 8 and 12 hertz, which is usually within the alpha range. Mirror neurons and autism. Research has investigated whether dysfunctional stimulation mechanisms may underlie the social and communicative deficits seen in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. That was back in 2007. This has been well researched and is now well understood that autism spectrum disorder has mu dysfunction, mirror neuron dysfunction. People who deeply grasp the pain or happiness of others also process music differently in their brain. Here's an interesting little piece that just came through. People who deeply grasp the pain or happiness of others also process musically different in their brains. These areas of the brain uniquely activate in people with higher empathy when they listen to music. Wow. So using musical soundtrack with brain entrainment to mu should really be a double punch, right? And here we are, music in the brain. Playing and listening to music works several areas of the brain. Corpus callosum, section between the two hemispheres, and when we use binaural beats for the headphones, it forces all the electrical activity of the right-left hemispheres to light up the corpus callosum, the connection between the hemispheres, corpus callosum. Motor cortex, you want to dance, a certain type of music. Prefrontal nucleus albicans and amygdala, emotional content of the music. Sensory cortex, auditory cortex, hippocampus, music, memories, and the emotional impact of music right into the emotional control centers of the brain. Visual cortex, cerebellum. Cerebellum, is involved in the smooth contraction of muscles, playing an instrument or dancing. Kind of all that stuff. Higher empathy people appear to process music like a pleasurable proxy for a human encounter in the brain regions for reward, social awareness, and regulation of social emotions. Fascinating. Fascinating how empathy and music are processed in similar zones in the brain and how that affects my interaction with other people. it sort of makes sense that now if I went to a big concert of my favorite music and the other 50,000 people at the concert, that's their favorite music, we really are causing an empathic, brain synchronized mode to happen. Empathy links our nervous systems together at a distance. Empathy expands the coupled oscillator phenomenon between people. The art of empathy is sharing something that's heartfelt with another person, sharing your heart, sharing an emotion, synchronizing yourselves up together. A new level of understanding of where another person is coming from. And the research is like going crazy with brain states and meditation and empathy. It was the Dalai Lama's research that showed that a spiritual level of empathy was associated with gamma brain activity. They also showed that 30 years of a certain type of Tibetan Buddhist meditation literally upgraded the brains of these meditators into something extraordinary that was not normal at all, not average, not regular. The Buddhist and the neuroscientist. What compassion does to the brain. That was the Dalai Lama's research project at the University of Wisconsin in 2001, where they took these monks that had been meditating for 30 years and hooked them up to super sophisticated brain mapping computers, fMRI machines, heart rate variability devices, respiratory monitors. They wanted to see what does enlightenment look like. It's an fMRI machine here. And what it looked like, it was massive amplitudes of gamma brain activity. That's what the news showed. Massive amplitudes of gamma brain activity. And when they asked these monks what they had experienced, universal empathy for all living things in the universe. Yeah, it's not just me mirror neuron, doing a mirror neuron thing with what I see is happening in you and empathizing with that. It's me empathizing with all of humanity, me empathizing with all living beings on the planet, animals and plants and bacteria. It's me extending that beyond the planet into the universe at large, me having empathy with all living things in the whole universe. That's where expanded consciousness and empathy are deeply associated with each other. And we can expand that with sound waves. The science of sound and the science of entrainment and the science of using sophisticated monitors to balance the core places in your nervous system that tells everything what to do, and put you into a zero stress point where you feel safe to do it. We can accentuate all of these. We can accentuate gamma. We can accentuate mu. We can accentuate the default mode network, my sense of self in time and space. We can pick the lock of neural programs that we can see from EEG studies of enlightened people and entrain your brainwaves to the same pattern as sort of enlightenment training wheels. In previous broadcasts, I've talked about how the heart and the brain are intimately linked together. That the measurements of the heart activity that lends itself to the most sophisticated monitor in modern medicine, heart rate variability, And we use this real-time version of that so we can see sympathetic, parasympathetic live. We can see the master control system live on a computer screen, and we can rebalance it with sound waves. Octaves of those sound waves, far enough down, are brainwave frequencies that are exact octaves. And training to any of those brain frequencies causes balance in the nervous system from a state of consciousness. And the balance in the nervous system is viewed on the screen from analyzing heart data. So heart and brain, heart and consciousness are now completely scientifically linked together as vibrational frequency coupled pairs. The heart in the brain and the brain in the heart, synchronized up together. And the one missing piece of empathy, the biggest, most important piece of all, is me with myself. My empathy towards me, myself. Me giving myself a break, me reaching out a helping hand to my own inner world to help me. Remember, you have been criticizing yourself for years and it hasn't worked. Try approving of yourself and see what happens. A new command I give you: love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. Share your heart with yourself. Present your empathy to your own deepest self. Or as Louise used to say, I love myself. And here we are. And to take this opportunity to say how much I love everyone who is here and part of this process. There is an empathic bond among us that we haven't talked about. We are connected together, most of us, through the Discord channel, the forums where we can talk to each other. And I see people's taglines and names, but I have no idea, no clue who any of you are, or what your story is, or what you do for a living. And in preparing this broadcast, the one thing that came to me more than anything else is I would like to know who you are. I would love to have every one of us in one place together physically so we could see each other and talk to each other and have a big party. In the absence of that, I think it would be a cool idea to use the forums, the Discord forums, for each person here to introduce themselves to everybody else and say, hey, here's who I am. Here's where I live. Here's what I do for a living. Here's what excites me. Here's how I ended up here. That information helps the empathic connection among us. It fleshes us out as real flesh and blood people, and not sort of an anonymous group that we all know is here hovering in the background, this huge agglomeration of very cool people who follow these broadcasts every week. And that's a special kind of person. We are all amazing people. Let's find out who we are. So I'm inviting everyone to please flesh out the Discord channel with who you are and what you're up to. Don't put it today on this small channel. Put it in Discord where it will be forever so everybody can see it. Meantime, thank you all very much. Let's put our headphones on, and here we go. By the way, I imbued this soundtrack with Mu brain entrainment frequencies. I want to start over again. It's almost happened. Sorry for the glitch and sorry for the little scare there. Fortunately, Shay is here. So I'm going to leave the chat thing open for a little while, then we can all move over to Discord. Usually you leave it open for about a half an hour. Thank you all very much. Love and blessings to everyone. Until I see you next week on Sunday.